An empty Moscow street on a weekday. Such, an ordinary gray day, when even the air seems to be saturated with fatigue. Somewhere far away you can hear the clatter of a tram, an irritated minibus beeping at the traffic lights. Life goes on at its own pace, people are in a hurry, faces are down on their phones, thoughts are fixated on bills and lunch discounts. It's business as usual. It's as if nothing in the world is happening. But on one of the shabby walls by the pavement sits him. An old man. Shallow, hunched over, as if carved out of the very grayness that has covered the city. His face is furrowed with deep wrinkles, his hands as thin as branches of a withered tree, stretched forward as if asking for something invisible. He sits silent, like a statue. At his feet is a dirty cardboard, on which is wretchedly written, "Help, who can help as much as you can?" People pass by. No one notices. Some quicken their steps, as if afraid of being infected by poverty. Someone catches his image out of the corner of his eye and immediately forgets it as just another trifle. But the old man doesn't look at anyone. His gaze is fixed on infinity, empty, icy, almost inanimate. As if he sees not the street in front of him, but something very far away, where he has long been gone. Half an hour passes like this. An hour. And then they burst into the frame. 25, white trainers, short jacket, the arrows of his sports shoes stitched with screaming logos. His hair is definitely from a barber, though he paid for it with angry $300. The face is young, but not completely clean. His eyes are reckless, with a shadow of a hooligan's fire. His friends are following him. How could he be without them? Fat Dima, laughing Kostya, and always inciting Gleb. The extent of the guise depends on Anton. He's cool.so there too. And today Anton saw a good target, an old man. Anton retraced his steps, slowing down so sharply that Dima almost crashed into him. The others also stopped, like a flock of pseudo-sparrows, ready for another entertainment. Anton raised his hand as if to indicate something. "Look, guys," he said, stretching his words a little, "have you seen it?" A grin appeared on Anton's face. Such a smile usually accompanies cruel pranks. Gleb was the first to pick up the atmosphere, spat on the pavement, and laughed a short laugh, as if from an awkward joke. Dima stared silently at the old man, his eyebrows slightly drawn together at the bridge of his nose. Only Kostya, the one who always laughs at the wrong time, quacked and added hoarsely, "Look at that, a bomb king on a throne." A throne made of. He looked round the dirty corner. Out of nothing. The old man still didn't move. His hunched figure didn't seem to belong to reality at all. He was here, but as if behind glass, in a parallel space where neither of them mattered. Only thin fingers, with slightly bent phalanges, like sharp twigs, remained in the same pose. Anton stepped closer. Now he was quite close, his trainers glistening against the dust littering the corner of the passers-by. A strange feeling stirred inside, but he immediately suppressed it. It was a habit, never to show weakness. He took out his phone and aimed the camera at the old man. He wanted to take a picture, post something funny in the stories. Sign it, Moscow, Center Glamour. The old man looked particularly creepy in the lens. His face up close resembled old parchment paper, torn at the folds. The wrinkles were deep, like cracks on abandoned buildings. Empty eyes stared through the camera. Anton suddenly noticed that the surroundings became strangely quiet. The noise of the street had disappeared somewhere. It seemed as if someone had covered the space with a transparent hood. The air became heavy and dense. Gleb was muttering something behind him, but the words came out with difficulty, as if through water. In the lens, the old man suddenly moved. A momentary movement, barely perceptible. A slight turn of the head, as if a rusty mechanism greased for the final push. The eyes, those damned eyes, were now staring directly into the camera. The lips trembled, and a voice came out of them. Not the voice of an old man. A voice that shouldn't have belonged to a man. Muffled and deep, as if it came from beneath the earth. Your sins are already coming for you. These words sounded like a bell striking the last hour. The world around him seemed to shrink, and a chill ran down Anton's skin. His fingers unclenched, and the phone fell to the pavement. The screen cracked with an unpleasant crunch. Anton stood there, staring at the old man. Now he was motionless again. His empty gaze was staring off into the distance, and his lips were no longer moving. It was as if nothing had happened. Dima was the first. Broke the silence with a nervous cough. Let's get out of here. Anton did not answer. He couldn't take his eyes off the old man. From somewhere in the depths of his subconscious, scraps were surfacing, childhood fears, forgotten memories, and something that had no image or form. Neither image nor form. In my head. Resonated in my head, sins are coming for you. When they finally moved away from the wall, Anton looked round. The old man was sitting as before, as if nothing had happened. But it seemed to Anton that his gaze continued to following him, through the backs, through dozens of meters. He shook off this sensation, but it would not let go. Gradually, strange thoughts began to fill his head. Where did that voice come from? Who is this old man? Why did the words resonate as if they were a prophecy? During the night, he had a dream. In this dream, he was walking along an endless deserted road, and behind him, he heard a stomping sound. Heavy, rhythmic, like the footsteps of something large and invisible. He looked round, but he saw no one. Only emptiness, torn by rumbling blows. When he woke up, Anton lay in the dark for a long time, trying to convince himself that it was all nonsense. But in the darkness, it seemed as if someone was standing outside the door. What if this was just the beginning? Anton could not get the old man out of his mind. The words he had said seemed to cling to his consciousness and would not let go. Your sins are already coming for you. That's rubbish, isn't it? But why did it stick? It's been a night. Not the most peaceful. Anton tossed and turned, trying to sleep. He could hear the sound of footsteps outside the door, or it seemed that someone was watching. But when he switched on the light, the room was empty. It was as if the space had absorbed the anxiety, and the silence was now alien, pressurizing. Waking up with a heavy head, the first thing Anton remembered was the old man. It seemed that the further he tried to put that moment out of his mind, the more firmly it stuck there. The coffee didn't help. Nervous energy was pressing from within, forcing him to do something, to go somewhere. Fuck him, he muttered to himself, buttoning his jacket. Just some bum. But his feet led him to that very place. The street was the same as yesterday. Gray, impartial. People were running somewhere, cars whizzing past. And here he was again. He was sitting in the same position, like a stone figure inseparable from the wall. It was as if a vacuum had formed around the old man, which passers-by did not notice. They just walked past without looking. Anton stopped a couple of meters away, put his hands in his pockets, and stared at him. Something about this man was wrong. Normal people can't sit like this, neither moving nor noticing the world around them. "What, you're still here?" Anton said out loud, as if he wanted to hear the sound of his own voice to dispel the sticky fear. The old man did not answer. Nor did he move. Only his outstretched hand, like yesterday, froze in midair, and his eyes stared into nothing. Anton felt irritation flare up in his chest. He stepped closer, trying to suppress an incomprehensible feeling of weakness. "Hey, grandfather. Why are you scaring people?" The voice was rough, but there was something else ringing in it. Overplayed courage. Silence. No reaction. Anton sighed heavily, looked around, checking to see if anyone was watching. Then leaned a little closer. "Are you even alive?" he asked more quietly. This time the old man moved. Lightly, as if by accident. His head turned an inch, and his lips trembled. Anton recoiled, but quickly pulled himself together. "You fool, you fool." Scared of the old man. The old man suddenly spoke. His voice was quiet, hoarse, as if it had not been used for a long time. And each word was like an old key turning in a rusty lock. "Are you satisfied with your life, boy?" Anton froze. He did not immediately realize that it had been said to him. The emptiness of the old man's eyes now seemed to be looking directly at him. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "What?" he said, trying to mimic a laugh. "What are you mumbling?" The old man didn't repeat it. He just kept staring. There was no anger in that gaze, no weakness. Only a frightening clarity. It was as if he could see right through Anton. "Are you satisfied with your life?" repeated the old man, slowly, in syllables, as if he was not asking for an answer. Anton felt uneasy. He frowned, lifted his shoulders as if trying to hide in his jacket. "Why shouldn't I be happy? I have a normal life. What's it to you?" The old man was silent for a moment, then nodded, faintly. As if he agreed. Or understood. And then he added, "What if you were being watched from above? What would they see?" Those words cut into my consciousness like a blade. The hum in his ears blocked the noise of the street. Anton felt everything squeezed inside, but he couldn't understand why. What was he even talking about? What other from above? "Fuck you, grandfather," he spat out and turned round, walking away with wide steps. The old man did not call out to him. He remained seated there, silent, as if he had never spoken. Anton walked fast, almost ran, feeling the growing anger pressing from within. At himself, at his grandfather, at this damn day. He returned home, threw his jacket on the floor, and tossed his keys on the table. The room was empty and quiet. The silence immediately began to press in. Anton collapsed on the sofa and stared at the ceiling. The old man's words were spinning in his head like a broken record. "Are you satisfied with your life? What would they see up there, from above?" That's nonsense, he thought. But then why did it feel so lousy inside? He felt a chill creep up his spine. From somewhere in the back of his mind an unpleasant feeling was rising. Something like shame disguised as irritation. He pulled out his phone and opened social media, scrolling through his feed. Empty posts, identical photos, people bragging about other people's lives. Usually that was distracting. But not today. He felt like someone was standing behind him. He looked round sharply. The room was empty. The light bulb on the ceiling flickered and continued to burn dimly. Anton laughed nervously. Fool, he said to himself. He had gone completely mad. He tried to convince himself that it was just a play of imagination. But the old man's words continued to eat away at his mind. If you were being watched from above, what if they really are watching? Anton shook his head, jumped up from the sofa, and went into the kitchen. He needed something to occupy himself. He drank a glass of water and stared at his reflection in the window for a long time. His eyes were tired, as if he hadn't slept for days. And somewhere deep, in those eyes, he saw something he didn't want to notice. What if you were being watched from above? What would they see? There was a quiet knock. Anton flinched. He turned round. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Maybe from the neighbors? Or was it just him screwing himself up? But fear was already sitting inside him. That sticky, animal fear that defied logic. He went back to his room and switched on the TV. Let there be some noise. Let this silence recede. The news flashed on the screen. The reporter was muttering something about rising prices and traffic jams in the city center. Anton didn't listen. He stared at the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickening a little more than usual. The night brought no peace again. In his sleep, he was walking down a long corridor. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the walls shrank, getting narrower and narrower. Footsteps could be heard behind him. Heavy, slow. He didn't look back, but he knew someone was following him. Something that shouldn't exist. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. It was quiet in the darkness. Too quiet. Anton switched on the light and sat up on the bed, wiping his face with the palm of his hand. Shit, he thought. Gotta get it out of my head. Just forget it. But he already knew he wouldn't forget. He had to go back. The next day, Anton went to that street again. He was drawn there by something inexplicable. Like a splinter that needed to be pulled out. The old man was there. Just as before. The same pose, the same gaze, staring into nothing. Anton stopped in front of him and looked down at him. His heart was beating somewhere in his throat. Listen, grandfather, he said hoarsely. What do you want from me? The old man didn't answer. He just sat there as he had done yesterday. Anton stepped closer. Who the hell are you? What do you want? His voice trembled, but he immediately pulled himself together. I'm a normal person, understand? I'm no worse than anyone else. The old man suddenly raised his head again. A shadow of a smile appeared on his face. And it was the creepiest smile Anton had ever seen. It carried neither joy nor malice. Only a cold emptiness. You came here yourself, said the old man. Anton froze. What? The old man didn't say it again. He just stared. And there was something in that gaze that made Anton feel small, insignificant. As if he was standing not in front of a man, but in front of a mirror that showed not his reflection, but something inside. Anton stepped back. His breath hitched, his head was ringing. He turned around and walked away. With each step he sped up until he was running. There was no sound or footsteps behind him. But Anton felt that the old man was still staring at his back. At home, he huddled in the corner of the couch and covered his face with his hands. "You're the one who came here." Those words rang in his head, as if someone was repeating them over and over again. Anton suddenly realized that the old man knew more about him than anyone else. But how? And why? Now he could no longer escape. The old man had taken up residence in his mind. And that look. It wasn't human. It's been 2 days. Or was it 3? Anton had already stopped keeping track of time. The old man's words echoed off the walls of his mind and wouldn't go away. At first, he tried to convince himself, just an old madman. A madman begging for a penny in the middle of a gloomy metropolis. What if he was really sick? But the truth was different. Every time the aggression pierced through him with a desire to forget, a little deeper the terrible truth sunk in. Something was wrong with this old man. Anton sat at his laptop, propping his cheek with his hand. He didn't understand why he was doing all this. Why search? What did he want to achieve? But the inner voice wouldn't let him stop. The first attempts at searching seemed like a waste of time. Queries like old people in Moscow, homeless people on our bot, strange beggars yielded only nonsensical rubbish, YouTube clips with shouting, altercations in comments, articles about social services. Not a single mention of the old man. Anton was angry. At himself, at the computer, at this incomprehensible feeling inside. He closed the laptop, left the room, tried to switch, but came back again. It was like a thread was leading him by the hand. He began to delve deeper. Digging deeper. Changing queries. He went through combinations of words, no longer thinking about logic, judge in the USSR, cruel sentences, Soviet repression, legends of Moscow courts. The more he searched, the more he felt anxiety growing inside. It was as if he were tweaking something that shouldn't have been touched a long time ago. Anton's hands froze on the keyboard. He came across a small post on some history buffs forum. The post was old, with yellow archival photos and comments that no one had read for a long time. Judge N, one of the most sinister figures of the late Soviet era. His name has hardly remained in the official archives, but old newspapers and rare testimonies allow us to reconstruct the picture. This man was one of those who signed hundreds, if not thousands, of verdicts in times of repression. Judge. Anton froze. He reread these lines again and again. Something inside clenched like a spring. A judge without a name. Executioner without a knife. That's what he was called by those who didn't come home. Anton's mouth went dry. He scrolled on. Judge N was remarkably cruel and cold. His face was never shown in photographs, and his name was barely mentioned in publications. People were afraid of him, considering him an executioner who ruled other people's fates for the sake of his career. The text broke off. Anton clutched at his mouse, scrolling through the forum feed. There were only comments further down. Someone wrote about relatives convicted by that very court. Others called it a myth. A legend. But all agreed on one thing: this man was a real fear. How did he, who decided the fates of others, ended up on the street? Anton sat silently for a long time, staring at the screen. His ears were humming, his heart was beating somewhere in his throat. The next day passed in a semi-coma. Anton did not leave the house. The judge's face, or rather, his absence, crashed into his consciousness. He realized he needed to dig deeper. Old newspapers, archives. He remembered digitized library archives and went to the state library website. He downloaded scans of yellow pages of newspapers from the 60s. The pages rippled with small print and outdated words. Articles about economic successes, production leaders, scientific achievements. But on the fourth hour of his search, Anton came across a familiar word. Case number 117. Sentence passed by Judge N. He zoomed in on the screen. The headline was short and dry. There was no judge's last name in the article, just a letter. It was as if history itself wanted to erase his traces. In case number 117, the convicted were found guilty of anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Sentence: firing squad. Anton felt a chill run down his spine. The dry lines of the article seemed empty, but between them it was as if someone else's voices were shouting. He found another article. And another. Case number 203. Judge N. Sentence: 15 years imprisonment. Case number 408. The convicts were factory workers. Sentence passed by Judge N. There were dozens of them. Each case was like a stone placed on his chest. He scrolled, read, counted the dates. Judge N. was everywhere. Like a ghost that left no living trace, but took hundreds of lives. Anton leaned back in his chair, hands in his hair. Inside, everything was churning. Who was he? How had he ended up on the street? Why didn't anyone know about him now? At night, Anton couldn't sleep. Headlines, articles, blurred lines rose before his eyes. He thought he could hear footsteps. Heavy, rumbling. Like in a dream. The next day he came across a rare scan from a newspaper. A photograph. A group of judges in session. Faces all blurred except one. A man sitting in the corner like a shadow. His face was semi-blurred, but his eyes. Anton recognized those eyes. Anton slammed the laptop shut with force. His heart was pounding. He jumped up, paced the room, trying to catch his breath. As if this couldn't be happening. He didn't believe it himself. Your sins are already coming for you. The old man's words sounded different now. Anton felt that something was behind them. Something huge, incomprehensible. It was as if the old man knew. Anton couldn't calm down anymore. He was vomiting inside. He was angry at the old man. At himself. How could such a man be there? How could someone who had taken someone else's life now sit on a dirty pavement? Executioner, Anton remembered the word from the forum. He saw the old man again and again. In his thoughts, in his dreams. He didn't know what to do. What to look for next. But one thing was clear, he couldn't stop it. Judge N. was still deciding his fate. Or was he making his own? That night Anton dreamed that he was running down an endless corridor. The footsteps behind him grew louder and louder, as if someone invisible was chasing him. The lights ahead dimmed and the walls shrank. He tried to look round, but he couldn't. Fear stiffened his movements. On the edge of consciousness, he heard the old man's voice. You will not escape. You came here yourself. Anton woke up screaming, covered in cold sweat. The room was empty, but he saw a silhouette in the corner. He grabbed the phone, switched on the torch, nobody. He was shaking. He knew it wasn't over. Anton stood in front of the corner where the old man was sitting. Once again the weather matched his mood, heavy autumn grayness, slush and rain, the drops of which did not hurry to run down the rusty gutters. But the old man was there. Exactly the same as yesterday and the day before. His hand outstretched, his eyes fixed on nothing. It was as if he hadn't moved all these days. Only his face, pale, riddled with deep wrinkles, resembled an old, shabby map, where only other people's fates are marked. Anton felt something tighten in his chest. He was short of breath, but he knew that today everything had to change. He couldn't run anymore. He had to understand. "Hey, Grandpa." His voice sounded rough, cutting the air like a blade. "It's time to talk. No more silence." The old man slowly raised his head. This time there was no indifference in his gaze. He looked directly at Anton, as if he could see through him. "What do you want?" The old man's voice was as dry as autumn leaves. Anton took a step closer, overcoming an inner trembling. "I found you. Your past. I know everything. Judge. Executioner. How did you?" He choked on his own words. He fell silent. The old man did not react, only stared at him long and tiredly. Then he said, "Sit down." Anton was surprised. He had expected everything, but not this. Not an invitation to talk. However, his feet moved forward on their own. He sat right on the wet curb, opposite the old man. People passed by, some turned round in surprise, but Anton didn't care. The old man sighed heavily and long. It seemed that he exhaled not air, but several years of life. Then he spoke. "I was a judge," he began, staring into the void in front of him. "You already know. You were looking, weren't you? Looking for me. Did you find me?" Anton was silent, not knowing what to say. "Then listen," continued the old man. "I was young. Damn ambitious. I believed in the system, in the law, in my own infallibility. We all did back then. Or pretended to." His voice was as steady as the cold wind. The words clung to my ears and screwed into my mind, leaving an unpleasant residue. I was given cases. Loud, important ones. One thing after another. I didn't ask questions. I saw only papers, articles, signatures. The person became just a name in a folder. He fell silent, as if gathering his thoughts, and passed his hand over his face. Then, without looking at Anton, he continued. "There were many cases. You found only one, but there were hundreds like it. Do you understand? Hundreds. People who disappeared. People who screamed in the courtroom, but nobody heard them. One boy. He was only 16. He wrote a silly letter to a friend joking about politics. A denunciation. An enemy of the people. His mother begged for mercy. She was on her knees in the courtroom. Anton felt his throat constrict. His hands trembled. And what did you do?" He squeezed out. The old man grinned bitterly. His laugh was as empty as an old well. "Signed it. I always signed." He was sent to a camp. 6 months later, he died of exhaustion. I learned about it later, but even then I stopped sleeping. I saw their eyes in my dreams. Do you know what it's like? He looked at Anton again, and his gaze was like a knife blade. To look into the eyes of those you killed every night. They don't talk. They just stare. Anton swallowed, feeling the weight of the words come over him. But why? Why did you keep going? His voice trailed off. The old man lowered his eyes. Because it was necessary. Because I was weak. Because fear is stronger than man. Fear of losing everything. Fear of what will happen if you say no. He ran his hand over his knee, as if wiping away invisible dirt. And then? Anton asked quietly. Then the car stopped. Time changed, people changed. Nobody needed me anymore. The Judge Steamer was no longer a hero. He became a monster. My name was erased from the archives. I was someone to be forgotten. His voice trailed off, and for a second Anton thought that a tear glistened in the old man's eyes. But the old man immediately brushed it away. Do you know what the worst thing is? He continued. It's not loneliness. It's the emptiness. You live, but you're not there. You're breathing, but you're not noticed. You want to redeem yourself, but you have nowhere to go. They're all looking at me. Everyone I sent away. Everyone who left through no fault of their own. And I hear their voices. He fell silent, and silence covered them like a shroud. Anton couldn't breathe. He just stared at the old man, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Why are you telling me this? He whispered. The old man looked at him with some strange pity. Because you found me. Which means it's your burden now, too. Anton jumped up like a stung man. He was shaking. He wanted to scream, to run, to forget everything he had heard. But the old man's words were already crashing into his mind like red-hot iron. Sin's return. The old man stared into the void again. He didn't seem to have noticed that Anton had left. But his words would now live on in Anton's mind. When he reached the house, his steps were heavy. He closed the door and slid down the wall to the floor. The old man's voice sounded in his head. You found me. This is your burden now. Anton closed his eyes, but instead of darkness he saw faces. The faces of those the old man had condemned. Now he saw them too. Anton woke up in the middle of the night from his own screaming. There was darkness all around, but he saw those faces in front of him, endless, silent, looking straight at him. He inhaled convulsively and wrapped his arms around his head. The old man's voice sounded in his head again. You found me. This is your burden now. Anton screamed, but the silence didn't hear him. Anton sat on the floor of his house, leaning against the cold wall. His gaze was blank, hazy. Outside the window, the rain continued to drum on the sill, and inside it was so quiet he could hear his heart pounding. Why am I bullying the weak? The thought was like a nail hammered into his head over and over again. Not long ago, he had thought the old man was just a useless piece of the past. Worthless, weak. But now, in his mind, that weakness had turned into an ominous warning. Anton remembered how he and the boys had bullied him, how they had laughed and made videos on their phones. How am I better? He whispered to himself. His voice spilled into the cool, empty room. He tugged at his hair, trying to get the question out of his head, but he couldn't. Pictures from his life surfaced one after another: how he had pushed a classmate at school, how he had made fun of a weak neighbor, how he had once walked past a woman asking for help. Why am I like this? It seemed to him that the old man had somehow left his shadow in him. Rotten from the inside out, like himself. Anton jumped up from the floor and began pacing the room like a hunted animal. Anger boiled inside him like a boiling kettle. It was him. It's all him. Anton slammed his fist on the wall so hard it made him dizzy. He's just a weakling. It's his fault he's become like this. It's his fault he's living like a bum now. But the words sounded false, and he felt it himself. Anger was his last weapon against fear. Fear that he might repeat his own path. What if I, too, were to fall by the wayside someday? Anton sat down on the sofa and stared into the void. He saw the old man in front of him. Saw his eyes dry, empty, like a mirror. Shit, he whispered. Sweat gathered on his forehead. Something cold clutched his chest. He couldn't sit in the flat any longer. The walls seemed to shrink and the air grew heavier. He went outside and went to the place where the old man always sat. But the old man wasn't there. Where are you? Anton muttered, looking round the empty corner. A gust of wind brought a crumpled, smudged piece of paper to his feet. It was an old envelope. The faded ink on it was barely recognizable. Ivan Alexeyevich Tikhonov. Anton's heart pounded harder. He bent down, picked up the envelope, and looked around. There was no one around. He unfolded it with trembling hands and discovered old photographs and yellowed letters. The photographs were amazing. They showed the same old man, only younger. In a jacket, with a confident smile on his face. Standing next to him was a woman with soft eyes and 3 children. This is his family? Anton muttered, not believing his eyes. In one photograph, an old man, then young Ivan Alexeyevich, was holding an infant in his arms. He was laughing. A real, lively laughter, which seemed something unreal after the blank stare Anton had seen the last few days. Anton unfolded the letter. Sweet Lisa, don't worry about me. Work takes a lot of time, but I do it for your sake. For the sake of our future. Someday this will all be over and we will live differently. I promise you. Give the children a hug. Your Ivan. Anton's hand trembled. He turned over another photograph. There was a house, cozy and well-kept, and on the porch stood the same children waving to the photographer. He was a father. A husband. A man. Anton slumped to the curb, clutching the photos to his chest. He couldn't breathe. Everything inside him turned upside down. The old man he'd seen as weak, useless, had once been different. When had he lost it all? When had he become empty? Anton saw his eyes again, eyes that reflected all his guilt. You found me. This is your burden now. But what exactly was his burden now? The old man's sins? Or his own? Anton got up and walked home. The pictures burned his hands. He felt them turn into a silent reproach. When he reached home, he dropped the photos on the table and started walking in circles around the room. Why am I like this? He repeated again, but there was no answer. I'm no better, am I? He remembered the laughter of the boys with whom he had bullied the old man. He remembered their phones pointed at him. He saw himself from the outside, young, confident, as cruel as those he hated. He shuddered. I don't want to be. I don't want to be like him. Anton shouted. But what if he was already like him? That night he couldn't sleep again. The old man's voice echoed in his head. Sin's return. He understood those words differently now. Not as a curse, but as a warning. He didn't want to repeat the old man's path. He didn't want to lose everything that made a man alive. But how? How not to repeat his mistakes? There were photographs on the table. On one of them, Ivan Alexeyevich was holding his daughter's hand and laughing. When was the last time he had laughed like that? Anton closed his eyes and cried for the first time in a long time. The next morning, Anton woke up with a heavy head and emptiness inside. The whole night passed in disturbing dreams. The old man stood in front of him, silent, with photographs in his hands, and around him there was an endless noise of whispering voices. In the mirror, he saw his reflection, tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He saw him in himself. The old man was now part of his life. Anton took the photographs and read the letters again. Now he imagined every word, every emotion that Ivan Alexeyevich had put into them. When had it all started? When did it all break down? Anton stood on the very spot where the old man had once sat. The alley was empty. There was neither his voice nor his presence. Only a light, penetrating wind that lifted dust from the ground. Anton didn't know what to feel. This place had become a symbol of something he could neither avoid nor cut out of his life. He stood on the threshold of destiny, but he felt like he was walking away from himself. He felt fear of what he might become. He looked again at the note he found beside him and read its words as if they were a prophecy. Leave with a clean soul before it's too late. Those words were like a warning, like a cry that couldn't help but be heard. It was as if the old man had left him one last milestone pointing away, but he didn't know where that path led. Everything that was connected with this place, with this old man, with his story, did not let him go. Questions kept rolling around in his head, but no answers came. He felt like time had stopped in this town. He looked at the clouds that moved slowly across the sky as if they were in no hurry to go anywhere. He didn't know what he should do now. Everything he had experienced in the past weeks was beyond explanation. He didn't know how to live, didn't know how to go on. He felt the pressure again, as if his soul were being squeezed by an invisible hand. He couldn't stay here, in this place, any longer. He retreated and walked back into the street, feeling the cold penetrate him to the bone. But it had always been like this. He could feel everything around him changing. When he looked back one last time to the corner where the old man had once sat, in its place of emptiness lay that very same note. But now it was more than just words. It was a mark of fate. He picked it up, unfolded it again, and read, "Leave with a clean soul before it's too late." Why did you leave? Anton whispered, standing in the empty street. He knew he wouldn't find the answer here. The old man wasn't just some bum on the street. He was something more. His silence spoke more than his entire life. And now all that remained were his words, his shadow. But what if the old man was right? What if he, Anton, just like the old man, would judge his life to the end, and his sins would one day return like an avalanche? We're all judges and executioners in our own lives. It's just that some of us realize it sooner. The old man's words echoed in his head again. He felt an icy fear seize his soul. Fear not of what was, but of what would be. Fear of how he would look in the mirror and see himself there. Fear of what he would become. He knew the old man wasn't a monster. He was a living person who had lost everything but remained who he once was. He wasn't bad. He was broken, but not finally consumed by evil. The old man could be an example of how to realize your mistakes, but what should Anton do now? Will he be able to regain what he hasn't lost yet? We are all judges and executioners in our own lives. His thoughts began to merge, his own sins intertwined with those of others, and Anton felt the weight of them catching up with him. Anton walked away, but his footsteps sounded different now. He didn't know what would happen to him next. Knew only one thing: his life would never be the same again. He raised his head, but his eyes were empty, as if the old man remained only in his mind, and in reality he no longer existed.